In 1994, he sheltered 1,200 souls from machetes and gunfire. Decades later, he stepped onto a plane and vanished into the hands of the very regime he had spent years criticizing. The story of how that happened does not begin in an airport lounge or a quiet hotel room in Dubai. It begins with the smell of fear and diesel smoke over Kigali, with radios screaming hatred into cramped houses, and with a hotel on a hill that was never meant to become a lifeboat. He was not a general or a politician. He was a hotel manager before the killing started. The Mille Collines was a place of polished floors and carefully measured smiles. The lobby echoed with rolling suitcases, hushed conversations in French and English, the clink of glassware, the low thrum of generators kicking in when the power failed. Business travelers and diplomats drifted through its corridors, crossing paths with flight crews and aid workers who treated the bar as neutral ground. He walked those halls with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned every squeak in the floor and every temperamental switch in the building. He knew which rooms leaked in the rains, which doors stuck in the heat, which guests tipped well and which complained for sport. On paper, his job was simple: keep the guests safe, comfortable, and far away from the chaos that often lurked just outside the gates. In Rwanda, though, the line between outside and inside was thinner than tile and glass. He had grown up in a country where identity cards carried more than names, where a line of Inkatu or Tutsi could decide who was invited to sit and who was forced to kneel. He had learned early to navigate between worlds: a Hutu married to a Tutsi woman, a man who could speak the language of businessmen and the unspoken codes of frightened neighbors. Years before, the world learned the word genocide in connection with his country. He had felt something tightening in the air. The radio stations changed their tone. Jokes turned into threats. Posters, speeches, and whispered rumors all pointed in the same dark direction. He watched it happen like a man watching storm clouds gather over a fragile roof. He could have left. At several points, he had the means and the connections. But his family was here. His life was here. The Mille Collines was his domain, and in some quiet part of him, he believed he could manage even this, negotiate, placate, bargain his way through whatever was coming. Then the plane went down in early April 1994. The presidential jet fell from the sky in a smear of fire and smoke. By the time the wreckage cooled, roadblocks had sprung up like thorns around Kigali. Trucks full of militiamen rolled into neighborhoods with lists and machetes. The radios did the rest calling, Tutsis, cockroaches, urging loyal citizens to pick up their tools and work. Work, in this new language, meant killing. He watched the city change in a matter of hours. People disappeared into their houses and did not come out. Gunfire stitched through the streets. Neighbors who had shared meals a week before now avoided each other's eyes. Or worse, joined mobs with red-stained hands. Calls began to come in. Some were from old business contacts, Europeans desperate to get their staff to safety. Others were from Rwandan colleagues, asking if the hotel might be a place to hide a cousin, a brother, a wife, and children. The Mille Collines had walls, guards, a foreign-owned name above the entrance. In a world collapsing into madness, those things felt like armor. At first he said yes in ones and twos. A family at the back gate. A friend's sister and her children. A neighbor who had received threats. He put them in empty rooms, then in storage areas, then in hallways, quietly adjusting the books while the official guest list grew more and more strange. Within days, the hotel was no longer a business. It was a refuge. They came any way they could. On foot, walking for hours through side streets, in cars that stopped far away and crept forward only when the roadblocks looked less alert. Some arrived, sobbing, having left family members behind. Others arrived in shock, eyes vacant, clothes spattered with things no one wanted to name. He stood at the gate as they came, arguing with guards, with local officers, with militiamen who recognized Hutu and Tutsi on sight and demanded explanations. He printed temporary IDs. He claimed far-flung relatives as hotel staff. He invented reasons for people to be on his property that sounded just official enough to pass casual scrutiny. But nothing about those days was casual. Word spread that the Milcolines was sheltering people. With word came pressure. Armed men began visiting more frequently. They swaggered into the lobby with mud and blood on their boots, hands on weapons, eyes scanning faces. Sometimes they came with clipped politeness, asking to see a certain guest. Sometimes they came laughing, joking loudly as if this was all sport and theatre. He knew many of their commanders. Before the killings, he had poured them drinks, arranged their meetings, smoothed over their temper tantrums when rooms were not quite to their liking. He had seen them as important men who liked to be flattered, men whose approval meant easier permits, faster deliveries, fewer inspections now. Those same men held lists in their hands. He met them in the bar with forced smiles and steady hands. He fetched the good whiskey, the imported cigars, the finest bottled beer left in the basement. He poured drinks he could no longer charge to corporate accounts and paid with whatever currency he had liquor, favors, deference. He flattered them, listening carefully to the way they justified the screams from outside as necessary, as temporary, as inevitable. He nodded and laughed where it was expected, all the while redirecting the conversation away from the people huddled upstairs behind his polite nods. His mind was always calculating. Which commander responded to what kind of praise? Which militia leader could be swayed with gifts? Where the line lay between charming a man and provoking his suspicion. It was a delicate dance, and a misstep could cost hundreds of lives. When one commander demanded a list of every guest, his stomach clenched. There were names on those room cards that would have lit his eyes with interest. Instead of handing it over, the manager spread the sheets across the bar and began telling stories. This one, a Belgian investor. That one, a cousin of an important figure abroad. Another, a supplier whose disappearance would cause bureaucratic headaches. He did not lie, exactly. He rearranged the truth. Upstairs, in rooms meant for 2 guests, families of 6 or 8 crowded together. The carpet grew stained. The water in the taps ran brown, then stopped. People whispered in hallways, praying silently whenever footsteps approached. Some wrote names on scraps of paper, desperate to leave a record in case they did not survive. He walked those halls at night, checking locks, delivering small bits of food, sharing a few words when he could. He was not a priest, not a doctor, not a soldier. He could not promise safety, but he could promise that he would fight for them with the only weapons he had: connections, negotiation, the hotel itself. Day after day, the killings outside grew worse. Bodies piled in ditches and floated in rivers. Smoke streaked the sky. Foreigners were evacuated in convoys under the watchful eyes of TV cameras, while Rwandans scrambled for any hiding place that might hold. He stayed. There were offers, seats on departing planes, spots in convoys filled with foreign nationals. He sent others instead, the wounded, the sick, those too fragile to survive another week in a crowded room eating thin rations. He told himself his place was here, that leaving would be a kind of betrayal. Later, some would say he could have gone and had every right to. He did not see it that way. He called every number he could. Brussels, Nairobi, Paris, the headquarters of the foreign company that owned the hotel. UN officers desperate to project control they did not actually have. Each call was a plea, a reminder, a subtle threat of international embarrassment if the hotel became a slaughterhouse. Sometimes the lines connected. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes a voice on the other end made vague promises. Sometimes no one answered. He learned which foreign managers would push his reports up the chain of command, which would file them away and hope someone else dealt with the problem. He spoke in measured tones, never letting the panic that simmered in his chest leak into his words. He knew that sounding too desperate was as dangerous as sounding too calm. Outside, the roadblocks grew bolder. One day, a militia group decided to test the boundaries. They came in numbers, weapons ready, faces painted with crude symbols. They pushed past the gate, shouting, eager for a spectacle. The refugees inside heard them and froze. Mothers pulled children into corners. Men positioned themselves in front of doors, knowing their bodies would not stop bullets. But feeling the need to try, he stepped into the lobby before the militiamen could flood the stairwells. The floor of his hotel, once a polished stage for conferences and cocktail receptions, felt suddenly fragile beneath boots and gunmetal. He did what he always did. He greeted them by name. He made a joke. He offered drinks he could barely afford to part with. He treated them like guests, not intruders. It was theater, and everyone knew it, but it bought time. When the commander demanded to inspect the rooms, he asked for a favor instead. This favor was wrapped in flattery and implication, tied to the idea that the world was watching, that the company that owned this hotel had powerful friends who could make life easy or difficult after this war ended. He implied that the commander's reputation was at stake, that restraint here would be remembered as wisdom. Raid by raid, visit by visit, negotiation by negotiation. He kept them out. There were close calls, moments when a young militiaman, drunk on power and alcohol, pushed too hard, moments when the commander's patience frayed, moments when one wrong word would have turned the hotel into the scene so many outside its walls had already lived and died through. Inside, the days blurred. People whispered news to each other, piecing together the outside world through fragments and rumors. A cousin killed here. A church burned there. A road blocked. A convoy attacked. A UN position abandoned. Fear became the air they breathed. He kept moving because stillness meant thinking about the numbers. 200 in one wing, 300 in another. Families tucked into linen closets, conference rooms turned into sleeping halls. Each face became a silent ledger entry under his name. If they lived, it would be because the choices he made held. If they died, it would also be because of those choices. Weeks passed. The world argued on television screens about whether the word genocide was accurate while people died in the space between syllables. Eventually, the tide of international pressure, regional politics, and battlefield victories shifted. The militias lost ground. The new government took Kigali. The killings slowed. The refugees in the hotel emerged slowly from their rooms, blinking in the light that came through curtains fully drawn back for the first time in months. Some had lost entire families. Some had lost everything except breath and skin. They left the hotel's fragile safety and stepped into a country that did not yet know what to do with its grief. The manager watched them go. When the last of the 1,200 walked out of the gates, leaving behind rumpled sheets, scratched furniture, and a hotel that would take months to physically repair and decades to spiritually cleanse, he felt a hollowness he could not name. The crisis that had defined every minute of his waking life was suddenly over. He did not feel like a hero. He felt relieved, tired, haunted. The new government took power with the aura of victors and the language of reconciliation. Trials were promised. Justice, too. The world applauded. Slowly, the story of the mill co-lines began to filter out, refugees speaking to reporters, aid workers piecing together accounts, foreign managers filing reports that mentioned a local manager who had handled the situation. With remarkable courage and resourcefulness, years later, a film would be made. Actors would recreate his negotiations. The crowded hallways, the tension at the gates. Audiences would weep in dark theaters, then walk out clutching their tickets, telling themselves that at least one good story had come from that hell. Awards would be given, speeches made. His name would be spoken with reverence far from the streets where it was first whispered in fear. Abroad he was fated. He traveled. He spoke at universities, conferences, churches, parliaments. The man who had once run a hotel desk now stood behind microphones, telling the story of ordinary courage in extraordinary circumstances. He spoke of empathy, of refusing to kill, of using whatever influence one had to protect those in danger. The government in Kigali smiled. At first, a hero served their narrative well. He was proof that Rwandans had resisted the hate, that goodness had existed alongside unspeakable evil. His survival and the survival of those he had sheltered were convenient evidence in speeches and brochures. But as the years passed, his speeches changed. He talked less about the past and more about the present. He began to criticize the concentration of power, the lack of space for dissent, the quiet intimidation of those who questioned the official story. He saw a different kind of fear settle over the country, less visible than machetes and roadblocks, but corrosive in its own way. He said so from the relative safety of exile. He gave interviews and wrote opinion pieces. He lent his voice to opposition groups, to activists who argued that true reconciliation required not just the absence of mass killing, but the presence of genuine freedom. In a region where political opponents often disappeared, this was dangerous ground. The government noticed at first. They responded with public rebuttals, calling him misinformed, accusing him of exaggerating, suggesting that distance had warped his understanding. Then the criticism sharpened. Officials accused him of siding with those who wanted to destabilize the country. His name, once linked with hero, began to appear in statements alongside words like enemy and traitor. His phone rang less often with invitations to speak in official forums, more often with calls from journalists asking about a new accusation leveled at him from Kigali. He watched from afar as allies in the country went quiet, as people stopped answering certain numbers, as the space for public criticism shrank. He could have softened his tone, stepped back into safer topics, let the film and the old stories carry his reputation through quiet years. Instead, he doubled down. The more the government tried to define the narrative, the more determined he became not to let them turn the page on their own terms. It was not only politics that drew him in. Rebel groups on the region's fringes saw in him a symbol they could use. Some claimed his support without his consent. Some courted him more directly. He gave speeches denouncing violence, but he also spoke favorably of parties in exile that many governments labeled as dangerous. In Kigali, those lines were easy to blur. The file with his name on it thickened. The day the plan to capture him began is not marked on any public calendar. There is no single memo that says, in black ink, that the man who once saved 1,200 lives must now be neutralized. But at some point, someone decided that speeches and articles were no longer just an annoyance. They were a threat. He traveled frequently, moving between North America, Europe, and various African cities. He believed in the power of being physically present, of looking audiences in the eye when he spoke about courage and cowardice. He also believed, despite the threats, that his reputation as a rescuer offered some protection. He was wrong. The invitation came in the form of an opportunity, a church group, a partner organization, a connection in the region. It was always some combination of the familiar and the flattering. There was to be a conference, a chance to speak about reconciliation, about justice, about the lessons of Rwanda for other countries, teetering on the edge of conflict. The route was arranged, from his home abroad to Dubai, then on to the region where he was told he would be met by hosts and security. There was nothing in the paperwork that mentioned Kigali, nothing obvious that said trap. Airports are their own kind of nowhere. He moved through them with practiced ease. Another man in a blazer with a worn passport. One more traveler in the long lines shuffling toward checkpoints. He sipped coffee in anonymous lounges, listening to boarding calls echo in languages he did not understand. Somewhere in the jumble of announcements, his own flight number appeared. Boarding now. The plane to Dubai lifted off in the usual vibration of engines and recycled air. He watched the lights of the city below fade into a smudge of orange and then into darkness. He thought about his speech, about the points he wanted to emphasize, about the stories he would tell to make abstraction feel human. He did not know that thousands of kilometers away, people were refreshing screens that showed the progress of his flight, watching the tiny icon move along its prescribed route in Dubai. The heat hit him like a hand when he stepped out of the jetway. The airport there was brighter, slicker, the kind of place designed to convince travelers they were safe so long as they kept spending money. He followed signs, past luxury shops and glittering displays, and made his way toward the gate listed on his itinerary. At the counter, a polite agent checked his documents and gestured toward a smaller plane serviced on a more distant part of the tarmac. He boarded with a handful of other passengers, none of whom seemed particularly interested in him. He buckled his seatbelt. The doors closed. The engines wound up. The plane began to move. He did not notice at first when the route on the screen showed a slightly different arc. He had flown enough to know that air corridors shifted for all sorts of reasons. He dozed, woke, dozed again. It was only when a quiet announcement crackled over the speakers, naming a destination he had not been told about, that dread began to tighten in his stomach. Kigali by the time the wheels touched the runway. Denial had given way to something colder. He understood what it meant to be delivered, unannounced, into the hands of a government that had publicly branded him a supporter of terror. The cabin air felt thinner as the door opened. Security officers boarded before anyone else could stand. They walked with purpose, eyes locking on him before he could pretend to be just another anonymous traveler. Passports were checked, then ignored. His name was spoken with a rehearsed finality. There would be no hotel lounge this time, no lobby to control, no back office where he could take a breath and plan. He was led down the stairs into a night that smelled of jet, fuel, and damp earth. The airport lights cast hard shadows. Nearby, a vehicle waited with its doors open. He climbed in. The doors shut. The tires rolled. The city outside the windows was the same and not the same as the one he had left years before. New buildings, new lights, new roads. The shine of development laid over the memory of bodies and fear. He wondered if anyone out there, awake at this hour, knew he was back. He did not ride toward the Mill Collins. He rode toward a place with high walls and questions sharpened into tools. Interrogations blur. The details of individual sessions fade, but the pattern remains. Bright lights, repeated questions, accusations fired like bullets, not to uncover truth, but to extract confession. He was asked about meetings, about phone calls, about statements. Names were pushed toward him, some familiar, some not. Authorities said he had supported a rebel group responsible for attacks on civilians, that he had financed violence, that his speeches were not calls for democracy but coded incitements to war. He denied backing terrorism. He insisted he had supported peaceful opposition, that he had never authorized bloodshed in that room. His past was both shield and weapon. He invoked the hotel, the 1,200 lives. The nights spent bargaining with killers to spare the people in his care. The interrogators invoked the same history to accuse him of arrogance, of believing himself above the law simply because he had once done something the world applauded. The trial came with its own choreography. He was marched into court under camera glare. The charges were read: terrorism, financing rebels, membership in an armed group. The prosecution presented evidence that critics abroad would later call thin and selective. Recorded calls, bank transfers, statements framed as proof of intent to support armed struggle. He stood in the dock in a country whose courts answered not only to law but to politics. Outside, international observers watched closely. Human rights organizations raised alarms about his abduction, about due process, about the message sent by hauling a prominent critic into court after delivering him to Kigali on a diverted plane. Supporters argued that this was not justice but revenge. Government spokespeople replied that no one, not even a man once called a hero, was above accountability inside the courtroom. The judge's voice was steady. He listened. He asked questions. He sustained and overruled objections. To those who wanted to see an independent judiciary, his composure looked reassuring. To those who knew how courts could be used as instruments, it looked like performance. The verdict, when it came, was a layered thing. Guilty on several counts. A long sentence. Years, not months. Enough to send a message to anyone watching him as an example. He listened to the words with a face that revealed less than his heart felt. He had known this was likely. You do not get tricked onto a plane and delivered in secret to a prison cell if the plan is to let you go after a slap on the wrist in his cell at night. The sounds were different from those at the hotel decades earlier. No whispers from crowded families, no children shifting in sleep on thin mattresses. There was only the scrape of guards' boots, the clank of keys, the distant coughs and mutters that drifted through concrete like ghosts. He had saved 1,200 people, and now struggled to save himself. Abroad, his name returned to headlines, not as the manager who protected refugees, but as the man on trial in Rwanda. Governments that once praised him found themselves walking a diplomatic tightrope. Some condemned his abduction openly. Others chose careful language, emphasizing concern without provoking a break. Activists did what activists always do. They organized. They wrote petitions. They staged protests in front of embassies, holding up signs that paired his name with phrases like political prisoner and unjust trial. For some, he symbolized the danger of speaking too loudly against powerful leaders. For others, he was proof that the story of Rwanda's miracle was more complicated than official slogans suggested. Inside the prison, his world was smaller. He counted days by the slant of light. He thought about the 1,200 people who had walked out of his hotel alive, wondered where they were, who they had become, whether any of them had seen the footage of him shuffling into a Kigali courtroom under guard. He thought, too, about the choice that had brought him here, the decision not to stay silent, the belief that the moral obligation to speak did not end with the closing of the hotel gates. Doubt crept in sometimes, as it does with anyone who has paid dearly for their convictions. Was there another way? Could he have spoken differently, aligned with safer groups, avoided the tangle of politics and insurgencies that made it so easy for his enemies to paint him with the broad brush of terrorism? But every time he followed that path of thought too far, it led him back to the same point. Silence would have been easier. It would also have been a betrayal of the people, whose names he carried like stones in his memory. The years did not pass unnoticed outside. Pressure built. Diplomats raised his case in private meetings. Legislators held hearings. To a government keen on projecting an image of discipline and control, the attention was an irritant. To a man sitting on a thin mattress, counting days, it was a distant warmth that might or might not reach his walls. Then, unexpectedly for those who had come to see his sentence as a fixed fact, the news changed. His punishment, the government announced, would be commuted. It was not an apology. It was framed instead as clemency, as a sovereign decision made from a position of strength. There was no retraction of the charges, no formal acknowledgement that the trial had been flawed. But the practical effect was undeniable. He walked out of the prison gates. The sky, when he looked up, was the same pale blue he remembered, stretched over hills that had witnessed too much. Security officers escorted him, moving briskly, as if afraid that the air itself might claim him if they lingered. He left the country quickly, under arrangements hammered out in conversations he would never fully be privy to. One day he was a prisoner in Rwanda. Shortly afterward, he was stepping onto another plane. This time with the world informed and watching exile again. He returned not to the hallways of a hotel but to quiet rooms in foreign cities, where his body could finally rest and his mind could not. Freedom did not erase the years in prison any more than the end of the genocide had erased what had happened on the streets of Kigali. His story now had two major chapters. In the first, he was the manager who kept death at the gate long enough for 1,200 people to live. In the second, he was the dissident who confronted the state that rose from those ashes and paid for it with bars and accusations. Some people wanted to simplify that arc, to make it clean. Hero, then victim. Courage, then punishment. The reality, as always, was messier. He had made choices some agreed with and others did not. He had walked into alliances and narratives that were not entirely his own. He had been both symbol and man, but one thing remained constant. When confronted with power that demanded silence, He refused to be quiet. He did not rush back to the speaking circuit. His body needed time. So did his family, the ones who had watched his face on television screens in courtrooms far away, who had fielded calls from reporters and supporters and enemies. Healing, in its own way, was another kind of negotiation, another series of delicate steps through trauma and expectation. When he did tell his story publicly again, it was with a voice seasoned by even more loss. He spoke not only of the night visitors at the hotel, but of the nights in prison when he wondered if the world had moved on. He spoke not only of bravery, but of cost. The hotel on the hill in Kigali still stands. Guests check in, drag suitcases over polished floors, breathe air conditioned by compressors that hum behind walls. Some know its history, many do not. To them, it is just another stop on an itinerary, another place to rest between meetings. Outside, in the city's new skyline, monuments and memorials rise in carefully designed arcs, honoring the dead, warning the living. Official tours trace paths through curated memories. Stories are told in ways that support a nation's chosen self-image. Somewhere, in that tapestry, sits the image of a man in a suit, standing at a hotel gate, refusing to hand over a guest list to men with guns. Somewhere else sits the image of that same man, older, thinner, standing in a courtroom, listening as a judge pronounces him guilty. In both images, he is facing power. In both, he is outnumbered. In both, he is trying to hold a line he believes must not be crossed. He will never be just one thing to everyone. To some, he will always be the man who saved them or their relatives in 1994. To others, he will be a critic who challenged a government they support or fear. To officials in Kigali, he has been a problem to manage in multiple erosa symbol. They once embraced and later sought to contain. But when he lies awake at night in whatever quiet place he now calls home, the noise of planes and prisons behind him, he can follow the thread of his life through both hells he has survived. It leads back, again and again, to a simple conviction that walls and titles and uniforms mean nothing if they are not used to protect the vulnerable. In 1994, that belief turned a hotel into a refuge. Decades later, the same belief carried his words into microphones, pushed him onto dangerous paths, and eventually into the grip of those who saw him as a threat. He stepped onto a plane, thinking he was traveling to speak again about justice. Instead, he was delivered into the hands of the state he had spent years exposing. And yet, even there, in a cell far from the polished lobby where his story began, he held on to the idea that courage is not measured only by how many people you save, but by whether you continue to speak when those in power have made it clear they would prefer your silence.